This morning, we're going to talk about the Reformation in Britain. And a lot of material here, and I have to give a little bit of historic background because as we've been seeing through this whole process, the church doesn't exist in a vacuum, doctrine and theology doesn't exist in a vacuum, and God uses all things. So that should encourage you on Tuesday night, whatever the results are of the election. Because he does. I mean, honestly, he is in charge of all these different things, and sometimes things go well, and some things don't go well, and sometimes situations work in a way that allows something to happen, and other times it blocks it. And we know that in our life, that is something that we all experience, don't we? So again, this class is not designed just to teach you about church or history. It's about how God works in the lives of people. And he didn't stop at the end of the book of Acts. He continued on. And so this is just some more of what that looks like. A lot of times we think about the Reformation, you just think Luther and Calvin and people like that. Well, the Reformation rattles through all of Europe. And this morning, since we're going to talk about Britain, basically in England and Scotland, it's intertwined with both the politics, the religion, the whole succession problems. Remember the fighting between the papacy and the monarchs and all this stuff. All those things we've already talked about all still come into play here. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of a background of sort of good old Henry VIII. And we're going to talk more about from the theologic perspective or the church perspective. He's not a theologian, but from what goes on there. Because Henry VIII actually, because of his political and succession and dynastic issues, is why you see the Reformation opening up. And it's not because he wanted it, it's because he had to have it. And so we're going to look at that and sort of the Church of England and that development. We're also going to look under some of the follow-on under Edward VI, and then we're going to look at some of the Catholic Protestant battles between Mary Tudor and Elizabeth, the good Elizabeth I, and Mary Tudor, or history often calls her Bloody Mary. By the way, just as a little historic fact, more people died under Elizabeth than Mary. However, Mary had a much shorter reign, so it was much more intense. And guess who got to write the history books and give the names? The victors, the Protestants. So if it had been Catholic, it would have been, Elizabeth would have been dead anyway, but she would have been the bad guy. And then we're going to look at Scottish Reformation with John Knox. Okay? And this is going to tie back into some of the things we've talked about with Calvin and Zwingli and the follow-on Bullinger and Theodore Beza and the Genevan Academy and all that kind of stuff. So all these things that we're talking about have what we've talked about before. Remember, we're sort of layering over the top of the different time periods. Remember the Peasant Revolt, the Knights' Rebellion, and all those kinds of things, the attack of Vienna, all are in these time periods. So if you just focus on what's happening in England, you're missing the greater events that are going on in the rest of Europe, which influence all of this. So we're going to try to tie that in, but go back if you don't remember some of these things. Go back and look at the lectures, look at the notes. The videos are online, so of course the last two aren't. Sorry about that. Being gone this week kind of threw that off. So that's where we're going to be. Let's start first then with good old Henry VIII and the Church of England. Bottom line with Henry VIII, he needed an heir. Regardless of anything else he was doing, he needed an heir. Because one thing that you learn about English history, French history, and any other kind of history, if you don't have an heir, there's a mess. And at this particular time, for the dominance of it, you preferred it to be a male heir. Though there were queens, and some of them were very successful, it's a lot more difficult to challenge a male heir than it is to challenge a female heir, because there's always those cousins and nephews and other relatives that are male, and that was the order. So he wanted a male heir, and that is what he's really going to be driving at this whole time. So it wasn't like Henry VIII decided, hey, I like to be a Protestant. If you guys remember when we were talking about Luther, the Pope declared him a defender of the faith for writing against Luther. And then we find out that he has to use a lot of Luther's and Melanchthon's theology and arguments to be able to use it as a break from the papacy. And then he's going to use some of Wycliffe's and Huss's and some other people's information. So he is a guy who is religious, but he's a religious Catholic. Now, don't try to examine his life too carefully, because you'll be highly disappointed if you want to say, hey, be like Henry VIII. No, don't be like Henry VIII. Not good stuff. From a political perspective, though, England and Scotland, even though they have the same area, kind of had a tenuous relationship with each other. England was still dominant, but Scotland was still kind of independent. It's kind of following the same United Kingdom concept that you even see today. And they try to solve problems by marriage. Why do people try to solve problems by marriage? We don't know. Usually you create problems. But remember, we come from a different time and a different culture. We don't think about, well, if you marry into this family, you get this, and here we're going to have the relationships. That is a relatively recent thing. And in some circles and societies, well, you have to marry into this family or that thing to get our family raised. You know, you still have the elite aristocratic families, you know, that we still have in this country. But in particular, the rest of us, us normal folks, we don't even think about that stuff really. This might be, yeah, okay, this might give my kids a better life, but that's not your goal and objective. But in this place, in this time, marrying family makes you family. So you have to treat family different than not family. So that's why alliances were often cemented by marriage. If you go back into the Old Testament, why did Solomon have all those wives? Because he was just, you know, a sexual predator? No, why did he have all those wives, even though he wasn't supposed to? Alliances, yeah. He needed to cement all these alliances. And if you have to cement the alliance with every single city, because they weren't big nations, you got to marry the daughter of this king and that king and the other king. So it'd be like the Denver area. You'd have to marry the king's daughter of Inglewood and Broomfield and Thornton and Denver and then some suburbs and Highlands Ranch and Ken Carroll Valley. And, you know, you'd be like, wow, you know, that'd be more 700 wives so you could have Denver functioning, right? That's the way they did it. And this is the same kind of an idea here. It wasn't multiple wives, but that's what they tried to do. They tried to build alliances between different powers. The problem that you get into is England is allying itself more with Spain, and Scotland ends up allying itself more with France. And you know how well Spain and France have been getting along. Therefore, you know how good Scotland and England are getting along. So, of course, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so that's what they end up doing. So the background in this is Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, tries to arrange and does arrange the marriage of his eldest son, not Henry, his eldest son, Arthur, to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. And by the way, Catherine of Aragon's parents were Isabella and Ferdinand, who, remember we talked about, drove out the Moors from Spain. They were the final... they took the final Muslim stronghold out in Spain, and that Reconquista we talked about that lasted about 700 years. They also are famous for what other interesting Italian? Columbus, yeah. They were the ones who sponsored Columbus in 1492. So this is the time period. All these things are happening. And so Catherine of Aragon, who is like 15 or something, is married to Arthur. So the princess in Spain is married to Arthur, the prince in England, and he dies about 4 months later or something like that. Doesn't last long, as he was not a particularly healthy kid, and he dies. And of course, you're married for 4 months, and of course the next claim is going to be, how do we keep this alliance going? Well, we need to marry to my other son. Oh, by the way, his name is Henry. The problem is you can't have your brother's wife. You go back to the scriptural perspective, okay, you can't marry your brother's wife. And so that's why the debate goes on, and I'm not going to go all the background as why the marriage was never consummated and all this other kind of stuff, because if it wasn't, then they weren't truly married, and, you know, the whole deal. And they do everything they possibly can, but guess who Catherine's uncle is? Oh, that old Charles guy who's wandering around fighting with Luther. doesn't work so well, because you cannot get the annulment particularly very easily, because you got to get the Pope. And who is the Pope fighting with? Charles. Okay, and guess who has the upper hand at this particular moment in time? Charles does. So he's got, you got all sorts of things that go on here. But they end up allowing this eventually. However, the good old superstition, well, there's no male heir. What's happening? What's God doing now? Punishing. See, this wasn't supposed to happen. This was wrong. So now you have the 4-month marriage that wasn't consummated, but you got the dispensation to be able to marry, and then you marry, and then there's no male heir, and you see all the swirl and all the people that are involved in this. By the way, this is really good for Luther at this time. So this is keeping all these people busy and not killing him. Remember, I told you, politics works in really strange ways. And so that's why Luther was still able to do his stuff, and Calvin was still able to do his stuff. Calvin later, of course, because of all these different kinds of deals. The other thing about it is, if you don't get the alliance between England and Spain, you have an imbalance politically between Scotland and England, because Scotland's trying to ally themselves with France. So they're building up their alliance, and then England doesn't have the alliance with Spain. You're hearing the word Bible in all this, right? Okay. So you see, things are swirling around, and of course they're talking about Bible. Oh, we can't do this, and it's illegitimate, and God's mad. But this is all politics. And the Scripture just used to cover and mask stuff. Some of it is really godly people trying to do the right thing. So don't get me wrong. We're going to see the theological background coming into play, but the politics is the backdrop between it. So now we get to the point where we go, all right, how does the church and state get involved? Catherine eventually, does marry Henry, and with the son failing, there's no male heir, but you do have Mary Tudor, who's going to become later the Bloody Mary. And she's the only surviving child from that marriage. So they become desperate. How do I get that male heir? I got to get a male heir. Well, the only way you're going to get a male heir is, take a very faithful Catherine of Aragon, who was very religious, very devout, very faithful to her husband, and very well liked, by the way. She was extremely well liked by the English people. And you got to get rid of her. So the only way you're going to be able to do that is now claim all the things that you had claimed previously, why you can marry her. Now you can't marry her. And oops, there was a mistake, and we were lied to, and all the other kind of stuff. So you get Thomas Cranmer, who is he's a Protestant leader, and he's one of Henry's advisors. So if you notice here's a Protestant leader who is the main advisor to Henry, who is staunchly Catholic. Okay. Well, until Catholicism gets in the way of his heir. And so you got... Politics make strange bedfellows, as they say. Well, this is a really strange one, because you got a Protestant leader trying to influence Protestantism in England, and a guy who's writing against Luther as the king. But what do you think Henry really cares about? His heir. So he says, hey, Thomas Cranmer, you're a really smart guy. Go figure out how to make this happen for me. Conflict of interest, a concept which does not exist in this time. The only conflict of interest is my interest has a conflict with yours, and I'm going to win. Wait a second, that sounds familiar today, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So, nothing has changed, guys. Cranmer, of course, is a main advisor, and eventually Catherine's daughter, Mary of Tudor, is going to have him killed later on. Why would she be upset with poor Mr. Thomas Cranmer? Yeah, he got in the way, because when this eventually, they do get through all these machinations, get the marriage annulled, she becomes a bastard because of an illegitimate marriage. And therefore, how well do you think you like the guy who got you declared a bastard? Yeah, so it's not going to work out well. I apologize for all this background, but it comes into play with all these different things. So we eventually try to get the marriage annulled. The Pope Clement VII is in this particular case, but of course Catherine is, the aunt. I'm sorry, he was not the uncle. He's the younger one. Forgive me. Too many aunts and uncles in relationships here. She's the aunt of Charles V. And he has the Pope under his thumb at this particular time. But Henry goes, hey, let's go back to Roman law. How long ago was that? Millennia and a half ago. Okay, so he says, let's go pull up the Roman law. And why did they have Roman law? Because of all those, humanists and all of the stuff that's coming back from the Reconquista in Spain and all of the other things we've talked about. See, now they have that ancient law. He says, well, it's the Holy Roman Empire, remember? Let's go pull back that Roman law back up. And so what does he do? He goes, all right, I am going to give money to Rome and place the English clergy under the king. So he's not taking over the church, but he's taking over the church. Does that make sense? So he says, look, I can follow this Roman practice. So if you notice here, you had lawyers involved in this too. Politician, law, and religion, economics, power, succession. How well does any of this work together? Just depends on the situation at that time, right? Who's in power, who has strength, who has money, who has influence. That's how it works, and that's what they're doing. So that doesn't mean Henry likes Protestants, though. He just wants to be in charge of the church. And therefore, he now eventually, in 1534, this is 3 years after Zwingli's death. Remember, we've had the peasant revolts and the Knights Rebellion and all that kind of stuff going on here. 1534, he finally breaks with the Roman Catholics. And with Cranmer's support and other Protestant leaders, I wonder why they would be backing Henry, the guy who hates them. But they'll support him because what's he going to do? He's going to break with the papacy. So what do they think they're going to be able to now do? Have influence over the Church of England. And that's basically why they support him. And unfortunately, then he, of course, declares his marriage to Catherine null and void, and he therefore can marry Anne Boleyn and the rest of the entourage that he has killed or, etc. The thing about this is interesting is, if we remember, we talked about John Wycliffe about 180 years earlier, and the Lollards, when we talked about them, the peasant or the poor priests who were preaching in the common tongue of the people, and all of the issues of church and state. Remember, everybody liked Wycliffe at one point, and then everybody hated Wycliffe when he applied the same principles to them. Oh, you don't have to do that this way. Church and state should be separate. Yay, wait a second, I want to be in charge. All that kind of stuff. Well, the Lollards, and if you remember good old John Huss, the guy got burned at the stake a few years after, about 50 years after Wycliffe in Bohemia area. Between those two groups, the Hussites and the Lollards, they've been in England all this time, and in Scotland in particular, preaching. So you've got almost 150 years of preaching and teaching more Protestant type of ideas in England. So if you notice, all this stuff's been going on in England while the rest of everybody's sort of hanging about. Calvin, Luther, other people read these guys and came to some of their conclusions, but this has been going on in England. So guess what? People are now available, ready, and far more the ground's plowed, so to speak. The seeds, when they plant, they're going to take root a lot faster. It's not like trying to chop down a tree and put it in the forest and hope something grows. The trees have been chopped down. A lot of the stumps have been coming out of the ground. So now you have a much stronger Protestant influence in England, which makes it much easier for them to influence Henry, which lets Henry get what he wants. If it was a really strong Catholic country, how effective do you think this would have happened? It wouldn't. If this was done in Italy, it would have not happened. But because of the work of Wycliffe and Huss and all that stuff and those people over that 100 and something years, everything's now ready. So when Henry decides to break, he gets supported. Even if they don't agree with him, he gets supported. And people kind of go, that's not bad. That does not mean there aren't strong Catholics in England. It does not mean there were people who were really ticked that he put away Catherine of Aragon because she was really well liked, etc. But again, this is politics, religion, economics, and power all playing together. Doesn't usually make a good mix, but it's happened. So he establishes the Church of England, and Cranmer goes, okay, we'll take that for now. Because what does that give Cranmer and the rest of the Protestants? Future opportunity. So they go, all right, we don't like what Henry's doing, but we'll support him. Now, Cranmer does work during Henry's rule, as the political environment, of course, gives opportunity. But let's see, I can't remember whether I taught this in basic Bible interpretation or background and authority of the Bible or this class. So if I haven't, this is all new to you. If I've already taught it. This is the time period of John Tyndall. Tyndall was under Henry. He was the guy who's considered the father of modern English translation. Okay? Tyndall was killed by Henry for trying to get the Bible into the common language of the people. And like a year and a half later, that translation under Cranmer gets put in every English church under the Church of England. Suddenly Henry's killing the guy trying to do this, and the next year, after the break, Cranmer gets the Great Bible, as it's referred to, or the Bishop's Bible when they add commentary to it, placed in every single church in England. So you've seen the smaller churches, or in older times you've seen the church with the pulpit, or the lectern open with the Bible open in the front. That's basically that's kind of follows along that tradition. So suddenly, from killing John Tyndall to Cranmer getting a Bible in English in every single church in England. Huge. What does that now do to all of the people in England? What are they permitted to now do? Read it. So now they can go check, did Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all these other guys, are they crazy? Is that what it says or not? See how quickly things can change? In a blink. And so these are some of the things that Thomas Cranmer gets moved forward. We also, if you, as a historic note, Sir Thomas More, you may have heard of him. He was an advisor and friend of Henry, but he stood in opposition to the Henry taking over the Church of England as its head. He wasn't crazy about the split, but he was definitely saying, look, I serve you as king, I honor you as king, I respect you as king, but no layperson, no, in other words, non-trained, etc., man should be over the church. He says, that I can't stand. If you want to have a separate church, fine, but not you as head of it. You need the church to be in head of it, not the king. And what does he get for that? Anybody remember? Yeah, he has a small problem with his life expectancy.
And he wasn't liked about it.
Yeah, people didn't do that. But you know what? Thomas More was a very honorable man. He was a very godly man, and he was a man of principle. And he basically, when he died, he said he was the king's good servant, but God's first. And he was later declared by the Catholic Church in 1935 as a saint of the Catholic Church. So Thomas More was a very God-honoring man, but you couldn't not sign that oath of fealty to the king. And he says, I can agree with all this stuff, you as king, I just can't agree with you as head of the church. And he paid his life for it. So, a little historic note there. Henry has one male child, Edward VI, by Jane Seymour. And he'll become king in 1547, which is 1 year after Luther's death. So, Henry outlived Luther by a year. And his son, who was not particularly healthy, Edward VI, becomes king. Now, his last wife, Catherine Parr, so all these wives of Henry VIII, well, the last wife was Catherine Parr. She was a supporter of the Reformation. So here's where you really see it wasn't Henry so much that was supported the Reformation. It was mostly his wives. Okay? They were the ones. And, of course, if you're a woman of that day, what extra ruling authority do you have? You don't. So what are you busy your time doing? Hey, I'm a Protestant. I'll help these people out. And that's what she did. She actually helps the Protestant cause and, of course, influencing her son. But you have, of course, have to have a regent, and they did. And you end up with his son of Edward, but he's under the regency of the Duke of Somerset. And Edward only lived 6 years. He was not a very healthy child or young man.
What happened to him?
He was just sickly. I don't remember if anybody remembers reading whether, I think it was a lung issue, but I don't remember. He just was a sickly kid. In those days, he could have died at anything anyway. So, now here we get back to theology. Yay! We're only halfway through the notes. We've gotten actually talking something theologic. You end up with Somerset establishing the Book of Common Prayer. Okay, now that's a big deal. That's basically, here's how we're going to run our services. Here's the things we're going to teach. Here's the stuff that's going to happen. And so he gave communion in both kinds, quote unquote. And this was done, that was put under Cranmer. Okay, so now Cranmer is helping write this stuff down. And that is, unfortunately, also going to become the battleground of theologic ideas. Because if everybody has to follow the book of prayer, the common book of prayer, whoever gets whatever in it now establishes the theology. It's like the doctrinal statement of the Church of England. Like we have a doctrinal statement here. It's not the Bible, but it's like, okay, here's what we believe and, lay out. Here's our understanding. But the common book of prayer included liturgy and all sorts of other stuff, that how you did it and what you did and how you said it. And when you start off with this, the first edition of this, here's what Somerset has. He says, the body, and this is dealing with communion, the body and blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, which was freely given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Okay, a Catholic and a Lutheran could go fine with that, right? Who could not go very well with that one? Starts with the last letter of the alphabet. Zwingli. Yeah, see, Zwingli doesn't hold that. Well, the next guy, the Duke of Northumberland, who becomes regent after Somerset, leans to Zwingli's understanding of communion. And so he, in the second edition, now that he's in power or influence, says, take and eat this in remembrance of Christ, that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving. All right? Memorial view. Okay? So the problem that you get here is you have one that says Catholics and Lutherans would be okay with this, Church of England. But a Zwingli person would kind of go, that's too close to transubstantiation ideas. I don't like that. And then the other guy brings in the theology of Zwingli, and guess what? Now the Lutherans and the Catholics are going, I don't like that so much. So if you notice here, you now have in the common book of prayer a theological battle between the different viewpoints. And if you remember what we said before, during the Reformation, the early reformers were very much in agreement on most things except what? Communion. That was the one place they didn't get along so well. So notice little words and phrases in a book that everybody's supposed to agree to. It's kind of like a doctrinal statement. How detailed do you get it? How open do you leave it? How broad do you have it that everybody can fit in or not, or it's only got to be this way? And you know what? That's a lot trickier than you think. How to write this to say it's about Christ, it's about Him, it's about, and what of these other issues are critical or not. Notice none of these are transubstantiation views. But they're variations on non-transubstantiation, from memorial to something kind of close to it, but not really. So here's theology, and guess what? There's going to be battles over it until a politician steps in. What do you think is going to happen if a politician steps in the middle of this?
It's going to be a mess.
Well, it's a mess unless they're wise. And we're going to see what happens here in a second. I haven't read that recently, honestly. I suspect, my guess is, it's going to read exactly what our next queen, or their queen after our next queen, wrote it, that allows in all views. And we're going to see that in a minute. I think that would be my bet of where it was setting up. So Edward dies. Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, now is crowned Queen of England. She is a staunch Catholic. She loves Thomas Cranmer. No, wait. She hates Thomas Cranmer. She hates Protestants. Because who are the ones who got her mom kicked out, divorced, and her declared a bastard child? The Protestants. It was really Henry, but they were the supportive ones, so he's not around to kick anymore. Kick the people who he doesn't like. So now you have the Catholic-Protestant battles in England, and this is going to go on for a while. So you get Mary Tudor, and then we're going to follow it with Elizabeth. So she becomes queen, and as we've already said, political, religious, and personal reasons, she tries to reestablish Roman Catholicism in England, puts England back under the Pope. How well do you think that goes on with the Protestants? Not so well. And so she begins very cautiously. She establishes her power base. Like anything, right? If you're going to do something, guys, don't leap off the cliff before you remember to buckle your parachute on. I've got a parachute and a cliff, jump. Got to buckle it on first. So what she does is she establishes her power base, gets things going, and then starts moving directly against Protestant leaders. So in 1554, she brings back the papacy back over authority over England. And then she restores all the feast days, forbids clerical marriage. As a matter of fact, she goes so far and says, if you're married, you have to put away your wife and kids. Okay? So in other words, you can't be married. You must divorce them. All right? That's how strong she goes from the happily married couple to you have to divorce your wife and get rid of your kids and declare them if you want to be a priest or pastor or whatever you want to call them at that time. And she begins to openly persecute Protestant leaders. Nearly 300 of them are burned at the stake. Others are imprisoned, and others flee to other lands. Okay. Gee, I wonder where some of those people went to. Anybody want to guess? Scotland, some of them. Most of the America, yeah. Not quite yet. Haven't got the pilgrims yet. Where do you think they went? Where was the safest, most protected? Switzerland and Germany, yeah. Germany was a little sketchier, but Switzerland, guess what was sitting in Switzerland? The Alps, yes. Some really pretty mountains, yes. Ski slopes, yeah. Hot chocolate, Swiss myth, yeah.
John Calvin established like a government there.
John Calvin and established in Geneva the governmental structures that are going to become models for cities throughout Europe. But what is even more important, towards the end of his life, he established that Theodore Beza oversaw. School. Anybody remember what it was called? The Geneva Academy. Basically, think about it as the key Protestant seminary for the Reformation. There were other ones, but this was like, the central theology for Calvinistic Reformation doctrine. And so as Calvin fades off the scene, this is where people go. The Geneva Bible. You ever heard of that one?
I have one.
You have one, yeah. Guess what? The Geneva Bible was some of these people went there, translated that updated version because they had the Bishop's Bible, the Tyndale version, and the Matthews and the Coverdale and all those. The Geneva Bible, these guys go as scholars there, translate into English because guess what? They're not under any persecution for Mary. And then that Geneva Bible becomes the family Bible. You had the Great Bible or the Bishop's Bible in the churches. The family Bible was the Geneva Bible with commentary. The commentary comes along with it is surprisingly, Calvinistic. Gee, can't imagine that. And therefore, that becomes the family Bible because it was small and there's a whole bunch of reasons for it. All sorts of cool things about that Bible. But these are the people who fled, you notice here, persecution. And what does God do with that? He takes it and says, okay, some of these guys are going to die, some of these guys are going to be in prison, and some of these guys are going to go and learn and develop more doctrinal things and be able to develop their translation skills and then be able to bring a really good pocket-sized Bible back to England. So if you notice, bad, really bad, crummy, and then good from our perspective. God's using all of it for particular purposes.
Is
So-
the Geneva Academy still around?
I don't know if it is. I'm not sure anybody in Switzerland knows who John Calvin is anymore. Europe's pretty dark. John, you remember? You guys have been in that area.
I'm not sure if it's around.
I doubt it is, because it's a very dark place over there when it comes to theology.
As far as, are they Catholics now, or what are they over there now, do you know?
They make our liberals look conservative.
What? Humanism.
Yeah, it's
What
bad.
did they say?
Humanism. It's man. It's all man-centered. There are good churches over there. We do know that. There are good churches everywhere, sort of. But it's tough. Now we end up with what happens is, of course, Henry's detractors. Of course, Thomas Cranmer eventually gets killed. He's the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer would not recant. That's what Mary Tudor tried to get him to do. So, in her great kindness, she took two of his closest friends, a bishop named Latimer and one named Ridley. You've heard Ken mention that in some sermons before. And in front of his eyes say, fine, you won't recant. Those two are dead. You're going to watch them burn. And this was I think the quote was from Latimer to Ridley. He says, play the man or be the man. In other words, we're going to die for our faith. And this is Cranmer. How do you think that is? Your two closest friends and confidants are burned in front of you because you won't recant. Well, guess what ends up happening? He recants. And then guess what happens? They're going to burn him anyway. Now that we've got your confession, we're going to kill you. And then he recants again. Matter of fact, he puts here's what it says. He says, with his recantation, it says, they were written contrary to the truth which I thought in my heart, and were written for fear of death, to save my life if it might be. For as much as I have written many things contrary to what I believe in my heart, my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall first be burned. As for the Pope, I refuse him for Christ's enemy and Antichrist with all his false doctrines. And so Cranmer then puts his hand in the fire and lets it burn till it chars and crisp and eventually dies. And so with that act of defiance and recanting his recantation, people sort of go, the dude, yeah, any of us can crack. And guys, any of us can crack. Trust me. We've been through survival training. You will break. People will break. So don't be too harsh with that kind of stuff. Sometimes God gives you the grace, but there's other times just like this guy. He loved the Lord, etc. And he broke, he recanted, and then he recanted his recanting. So sometimes people fall, and we have to give them a bit grace, because I don't know about you, but how would you like your two best friends burned alive in front of you? People, your family, your friends, people like that, that's one of the greatest pressures there is to place on any human being. And that's exactly what thugs do. If you want to do it, that's what they do. But he recanted his recantation, and everybody went, he did believe he was a faithful man. Let's press on. So that gave all the other people the heart to stand. That's that death that encourages, just like a lot of the martyrs earlier on we talked about. So we get a lot of martyrs during this particular time.
Would you say just that, the obvious that he was the onset of them
Well, there were a bunch of people involved that were martyrs, but he was one of the key leaders. A lot of times when we think about stuff, you don't realize that we only pick up some of the key people that history has written about. There were hundreds of other people who, in the same way, died, and in the same way were faithful. And the only reason you know about them is their family knew about them, or their friends knew about them, or other people knew about them in that area. So you don't have to be a famous person to be faithful. We just hear about faithful, famous people. That doesn't mean they're any more or less faithful than some of these other guys. So it's just what we hear about. Mary, of course, pressures the Protestants even further, and it fails. What was the lesson way back earlier in church history that Emperor Julian learned about what happens when you pressure true Christians and you martyr them and you try to kill them? Yeah, it multiplies because people see what real faith is. I am willing to die for this. Hey, I need to know about something you're willing to die for. And so again, remember, he just tried to persecute them and take away their education, all that other stuff. Slow grinding away at people is far more effective in squashing something than killing them. And unfortunately, people don't learn that lesson. So, if you want to be an evil dictator, you now know how to be an evil dictator. Don't just kill people. Then we get Queen Elizabeth. So in 1558, Mary dies, and her half-sister, Elizabeth, takes the throne. And many of those people who were overseas returned back from exile. And to make it simple, Elizabeth was actually a very wise ruler. And she was a moderate Protestant. Okay? What that means is, I know how to try to keep the peace within the church and put a broad enough swath there that everybody can try to live together, though everybody may be someplace in here. But she's also the political ruler, and she has to keep her kingdom. So it's really bad to be the patriarch, if you will, and the emperor. You know? And that's kind of what ends up happening, because, of course, this is how things move forward. I mean, the King or Queen of England is still the head of the Anglican Church by default. So Queen Elizabeth II is the head of the Anglican Church even to today. But she is a much shrewder person. That does not mean that she does not practice execution and things like that, because she does. But from a theologic perspective, watch what Elizabeth does to the common book of prayer. We've heard here's the Lutheran and Catholics can agree to it, and then here's only the Zwinglian people can agree to it. So she updates the common book of prayer to read this: the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given to preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him and the heart of the faith with thanksgiving. Hey, a sales call. Amazing. Isn't that fun? Even on Sundays. Sorry. So, what do we see here? This is something that a Zwinglian memorial person could say, yeah, okay, I can agree with that first sentence. And the other people could say, well, yeah, I remember, I can agree with that second sentence. By putting the two together, they all can agree to it, but for different reasons. See, that's the politician. But theologically, there isn't anything wrong with it either. So see, sometimes we can hold views that permit a little bit of grace. And what are we really about? Everybody has to say it exactly the same reason. Did you say potato and I said potato? Thee versus the. Oh my gosh, they said the instead of the. And, sometimes you have to keep that nice, healthy balance. And so she's doing that. And if you notice here, everybody can agree to those statements. Staunch Catholic could say, okay, and it did turn into the body and blood. And a memorial Zwinglian guy can say, yeah, I agree with this, to preserve thy body to everlasting life. I can agree to that too. And yes, everybody can agree that we're going to do it in remembrance, because it says right there in the scriptures. So again, see, Elizabeth is trying to be a very moderate ruler that is both trying to do good theologically and do good politically. Now, like I told you, she has plenty of enemies. Oh, gee, there's this other Mary, floats around out there, that we're going to talk about in a second. But the 39 articles, I think I mentioned this before, the 39 articles of the Anglican Church were based on a lot of Luther's writings, Melanchthon stuff, and the Confession of Augsburg, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So all of these things established those practices, and though it did condemn certain Catholic things, most of the Catholics went, whatever. They weren't too worried about those things. So a lot of people rightly say that the Anglican Church and the Episcopal Church in the U.S., and again, these are of those times versus now times, Lutheranism, Anglicanism are kind of like Catholic light. A lot of the traditions and carry on and practices that look very Catholic, but many of them, salvation by grace through faith. Now, I'm not talking about what splinters and divisions and all that have happened. And there are some that are more evangelical Protestant looking and less Catholic looking, and there's others that are more Catholic looking. But again, these are gradations. But here, Catholics and Protestants of that time pretty much could get along. Now later on, we're going to find out the nonconformists and people like John Bunyan from the Puritans. We're going to see that movement here in a little bit, but that's going to be part of the reaction to it. And guess what? That's not going to go well with the Church of England because, of course, they're disagreeing with other things that most people could agree to at this time. It doesn't mean we would agree to all of it, but they could agree to all of it. So if you remember where people come from and where people are, helps people understand what they can and can't agree with. Radical change is very difficult. Gradual change is actually quite easy if it's done well. Now, Elizabeth isn't going to declare. You got the Mary Stuart, who's the relative of her in Scotland, and so if Elizabeth ends up being declared illegitimate, Mary then becomes the ruler of England. So, what do you think Mary's going to try to do? Try to get her somehow declared illegitimate or whatever else, or get rid of her. And unfortunately, too many threats on Elizabeth's life get linked to Mary, swirling around her. So Elizabeth puts her in prison as a queen. And there's still more issues that keep coming back to Mary. And eventually she has her killed. She doesn't want to. She wants to treat her as royalty. Because one thing that you don't want is royals killing royals, because that sets a really bad precedent for you. You want royals treating royals well, so if the tables turn on you, you want to treat them as royal. Because at that time, people thought royals were different than other people. And killing a royal is not a smart thing. Unfortunately, there's enough, okay guys, there's 97 pieces of whatever here that prove that she's behind this, I got to deal with it. And so she did, and strangely, the plot sort of dropped off. So she ends up having to kill Mary Stuart. So that leads us, unfortunately, into way too less time, to John Knox. Now, John Knox is the guy who's basically the reformer of Protestantism in Scotland. And we have to roll back to 1502, where we again had that same interplay of Henry VII trying to get daughters and sons and the relationships all hooked up together so that they can have peace there. It doesn't work real well because James IV of Scotland was to marry Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII. Okay? And the Scots don't like that so much. And so they want to move closer to France, so they send James to marry Mary of, I think it's pronounced Guy. Okay? Of France. And the two countries are, of course, taking different paths. But the Scottish Parliament wants to shut down Protestantism, even though Protestantism is actually stronger in Scotland than it is in England. So in 1528, they pass these laws against Protestant teaching, and doesn't work. Because they have already infiltrated the Scottish nobility and the universities. Jesus, does sound familiar? James V dies in 1542, and the heir of the throne is the infant Mary Stuart. And, of course, Henry VIII attempted to arrange the marriage between Edward and Mary, but that didn't work because those who favored Catholicism in France got her to France for her education. And about this particular time, the Protestants take the castle of St. Andrews, kills the archbishop, probably doesn't endear you to too many people, and the government tries to take it back and fails. So the castle at St. Andrews becomes the rallying point for Protestantism in Scotland. And therefore, enter John Knox. 1515, so he was 2 years old when the 95 Theses were nailed to the door. He was 2 at that time. In 1515, he was born. He studies theology, gets ordained sometime around 1540, and becomes the tutor of the children of the noblemen who took St. Andrew's Castle. So here's this guy minding his own business, learning his theology, tutoring kids, and suddenly he is thrust into the middle of a rebellion. And he really wanted to get away and head to Germany. His plans, God had different plans. And he gets told, by the way, you're going to stay in the castle, you're going to tutor my kids, and you need to be the preacher for all the people in St. Andrew's Castle. So suddenly John Knox becomes the voice of the Protestant Reformation in England. Who would have thunk? John Knox was not looking for this. Have you guys got this thing in history that God usually doesn't let you do what you think you ought to do? Especially if you want to go somewhere else. But God, I want to go over there. And it's like, no, you're going to be here. But I don't want that. And he's like, well, tough. I'm going to use you. And he does. And Knox helps the people, rallies around stuff, but the government eventually takes back the castle. And under the terms of surrender, they weren't supposed to be treated in a certain way. However, they lie. Gee, surprise. Come to the dark side, we have cookies. We lied about the cookies. And guess what? They lied. So good old John Knox, who was minding his own business, who was just a guy teaching kids, who ended up being forced to be the pastor of it, gets sent to the slave galleys. So he gets imprisoned as a galley slave, so to speak. And he eventually escapes, though, and he ends up going to, Geneva and Zurich. Let's see, Geneva, Calvin, Zwingli, Beza, Zwingli is in Zurich, and then Bullinger. Remember we talked about him real briefly when we talked about Zwingli? Bullinger, who takes over for Zwingli in Zurich. So he goes there, and suddenly he gets all the training and the education and the indoctrination and all the other stuff for the Calvinistic doctrine. So in 1558, Mary Stuart is married to the heir of the French throne at age 16. She's also now Queen of Scotland, has some claim on the English throne. Mary Tudor dies 1558. Elizabeth takes the throne, and again, Mary is encouraged to come back to Scotland, etc. Her husband, who was going to be the King of France, dies. So she was like, well, I have no claim on anything. So she goes back to Scotland. And that's where we end up with all of the problems that come along with her. She, in 1560, tries to be moderate till she gets her strength and her power base. Goes after the Earl of Moray, who is a Protestant noble, tries to keep her in check. Knox, of course, is not a quiet man now. If you've been kind of mistreated by the government and you were lied to and made a galley slave, and now you go learn the stuff and see he kind of becomes a fiery opponent of the dear queen. He did not get along well with women, just so you know. And of Catholic ones in particular. So he and Mary go at it again. So Knox supporters create the Reformed Church of Scotland. It develops later into Presbyterianism. Very similar types of things, the Book of Discipline, the Common Book of Order, and the Scots Confession. So same types of things that are in England, he helps establish in Scotland. Mary Stuart ends up becoming, again, involved in those intrigues. She gets routed by the Protestant forces in Scotland, flees to Mary, thinking she's going to get protection, and we've already talked about that. She eventually ends up getting killed. Now, during her absence, Knox is supported by that regent again, Moray, James Stuart, I think, the Earl of Moray. And he helps out with all these different faction negotiation, because you end up with a bunch of people negotiating, because all the Protestants aren't all the same. They have different challenges, and he's trying to get all this stuff together. Knox suffers most likely a stroke. They said a paralysis. Most likely it was a stroke. And he withdraws from public life at this time. Just before he dies, though, he gets up when he hears about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, which is another lesson. We're going to talk about that, which is, again, happening at the same time. He gets up and he pleads for the Scots to continue their struggle, else they might end up being massacred just like the folks in France were. A few days later, Knox dies. But by this time, the Reformation and all of this structure of the Church, the Reformed Church of Scotland, is established, in place, etc. And so Knox is, again, a guy who was in a particular place, through circumstances got placed where God wanted him, and even being thrown into a galley, escaping, goes to the next place God wants him to learn and grow and bring stuff, and then comes back to where he never really wanted to be in the first place, and becomes the leader. Again, not his desire. And yet he fights valiantly all the way to the end of his life. And if you notice here, he didn't just die a peaceful death. I mean, the guy was paralyzed and etc., and eventually dies after all these different kinds of things. So the life of a reformer is not necessarily what you think it is. Yes, we just preach the little doctrinal thing and everybody agrees and we're all good, right? Doesn't work that way, does it? And so all these things that we've been talking about in these last 4 or 5 lessons are all going on at the same time. Anybody want to live in Europe about now? Anybody want to disagree with anybody about now? Here, let me be a peasant in my mud hut back in the woods where nobody can find me. Unfortunately, God does not always give us that peace. He calls us to act and be faithful wherever we are. And He will place us wherever we need to be. And therefore, we have to be faithful whatever that ends up being. Whether a tutor, whether a preacher, whether a galley slave, whether a student or a reformer. Doesn't matter. Or whether you're working at McDonald's or working in high finance or working at whatever, God calls us to serve Him where He put us. Because He has a reason whether we understand it or not. And many times we don't. So don't forget all these things and all of life's vicissitudes. Forgive me, can't pronounce anything this morning. It's important that we realize God has us exactly where He wants us to be. And we need to be faithful where that is.